The economic, technological, and cultural developments that took place in northern China during the first millennium BCE may not specifically be assigned to either the Shang Dynasty, which we discussed in the previous tutorial, or the first part of the Zhou Dynasty that came after it, because the innovations of the Shang period continued and were developed further in the Zhou kingdom of the 11th through the 8th centuries BCE. This era is known as the Western Zhou, to distinguish it from the Eastern Zhou of the 8th through 3rd centuries, when many political, social, and economic changes took place. During the Western Zhou, the outlying parts of the empire were largely left to govern themselves in accordance with the principle of fengjian, or grant and establishment, which gave local aristocrats control of the lands to the east of the kingdom's heartland in exchange for a share of their agricultural produce, and an oath of loyalty to the king, which would be put into practice in times of war or invasion. These nobles were given one of a number of titles that reflected their seniority, from duke, or gong, down to baron, or nan, though as they grew more independent over the course of the dynasty, their actual power had little to do with their assigned rank. Below the nobility were the local aristocracy, the merchants, the workers, and finally the peasants, to whom the king gave a share in the available farmland for them to work themselves, while other shares were given to the nobles who hired others to work it for them. Professions were hereditary in the sense that the eldest son would take up his father's work. The Fengjian states had their own systems of justice and taxation, and even their own forms of money, and because this form of government came to be associated with the philosophy of Confucius, it was seen by later eras of Chinese history as an ideal of political organization. But alongside this decentralization, the concept of the mandate of heaven solidified the place of the king, while leaving open the possibility that a king who was seen as a failure might be overthrown on the grounds that he had lost his divine support. There were further developments in technology, economy, and infrastructure during the Zhou period. Irrigation works were expanded, and trade increased as new roads and canals were built. These projects were made possible by the development of more centralized and professional bureaucracies within the vassal states, which made good use of the wealth they acquired from agriculture and taxation. The technique of forging iron, which would become an essential resource for producing weapons, appeared by the 6th century, and the writing system also developed further from the form that was used on the Shang oracle bones. The Zhou period is also famous for the works of literature it produced. The Zhou Yi, which acts as the core of the I Ching, a text used to understand the will of heaven, which also became a philosophical work, was composed at this time, legendarily ascribed to the brother of Wu, the first Zhou king. The poems included in the Classic of Poetry, one of the 5 classics later attributed to Confucius, were also composed during the Western Zhou. Confucianism in general, in the sense of a philosophy that promotes social order and self-improvement, became a dominant belief, though it was suppressed during the Qin dynasty that followed the Zhou. Over the course of the Western Zhou period, the Fengjian system gradually broke down as the local nobles, who had originally been close relatives of the king but were now much more distantly connected to him, became entirely independent of the royal court. It came to an end along with the Western Zhou in the 8th century BCE, when one of these nobles, the Marquis of Shen, went to war with King Yu, who had married the Marquis's daughter to cement their alliance, but threw her aside in favor of another woman. After defeating Yu with the help of a nomadic tribe, the Marquis installed his own grandson as the new king, and the capital was moved eastward to Wangcheng. The Eastern Zhou is traditionally divided into 2 periods. The first, which lasted until the early 5th century BCE, is named the Spring and Autumn, after a work by that name which chronicles one of the Zhou states during this era, and is another of the 5 classics associated with Confucius. During this period, conflict with the Zhou kings developed into open war. At the end of the 8th century, the state of Zheng attacked the army of King Huan during a dispute over territory, injuring the king, and his successor was nearly assassinated by the members of his own court. The dukes who ruled the vassal states fought both foreign enemies, like the barbarian Rong people, and each other, though a group of 12 dukes decided to form a council in order to coordinate their joint foreign policy. This council was led by the state with the most powerful army, which was appointed over the others by the king. During the 7th century, a series of different dukes were given this appointment. At first, the lack of central authority allowed the Fengjian to splinter into around 150 states, which were often no larger than a single city, but over time the smaller states were absorbed by the larger ones until only 4 of them were left. These were Chu, Qin, Jin, and Qi. Early in the 6th century, they attempted to cease fighting by stabilizing their borders, but they were not successful. There were also conflicts between elite families of the individual states. In the 5th century, the powerful state of Jin was divided up between the Han, Zhou, and Wei clans, which then became separate powers. It was during the late 6th century that the figure Sun Tzu, who may have been a later invention, was said to have developed the strategic ideas that would eventually be compiled in the Art of War, in the hopes that good military tactics would allow some of the vassal states to defeat the others, and bring an end to constant warfare. But even though the spring and autumn and warring states periods are often associated with conflict and chaos, they are also considered the most fruitful age of Chinese philosophy, which is called the 100 Schools of Thought, because it gave birth to several different philosophies. Confucius, who became so influential that all of the anonymous literary and philosophical works of the time were later attributed to him, lived in the second half of the 6th century, while Lao Tzu, who is traditionally considered the author of the Taoist work Tao Te Ching, was believed to be his contemporary, though he may actually have lived during the Warring States period. Taoism offered an alternative to Confucianism by promoting a way of life that was spontaneous and in accordance with nature, rather than one grounded in social order and ritual. In addition to Confucianism and Taoism, the most influential schools of the time were legalism and Moism. Legalism saw human beings as inherently uncooperative and disrespectful of authority, so rather than encouraging the sort of individual responsibility and decency that Confucius advocated, it promoted the use of law to force people into treating each other properly, and privileged the desires of the state over those of the people. On the other hand, Moism emphasized the importance of universal respect, a modest way of life, pacifism in relations between states, as well as the obedience of subjects to their rulers, and rulers to the will of heaven. The second half of the Eastern Zhou, which is called the Warring States, was a time of constant conflict between the vassal states of the Zhou Empire, which were by then functionally independent. At the same time, these states continued to recognize the Zhou monarch as their figurehead, although he no longer controlled even his own original territory. This meant that the court could not draft its own armies, and had to rely on its vassal states for its defense. During this period, between the 5th and 3rd centuries, conflict escalated into outright war as 7 states absorbed the others and then fought one another for control. 3 of these had been part of the state of Jin until its leading families divided up into separate kingdoms. The rulers of these states increasingly rejected the traditional belief in the Zhou mandate of heaven, to the point that during the mid and late 5th century, 5 of them, the rulers of Qi, Wei, Qin, Han, and Yan, declared themselves kings. They also made changes to their armies, making more use of iron weapons, replacing composite bows with crossbows, and adopting the cavalry tactics they learned from northern nomadic groups like the Qiongnu. As these large states became more powerful militarily, they also became more centralized and bureaucratic. Adopting the principle of legalism, they reduced the power of local aristocrats and replaced them with officials chosen from the lower classes for their skills and training. In the middle of the 4th century, the state of Qin changed many of its economic, social, and military policies. Its chief minister, Shang Yang, decreed that farmers whose crop yields exceeded the quotas imposed on them would be rewarded with slaves taken from farmers who failed to meet them. He also encouraged farmers from other states to move to Qin and drafted peasants into its army. Young people were forced to marry and given financial incentives to have more children, and families were taxed if their sons lived together in the same household rather than starting their own. The increased population and agricultural production that resulted from these policies led the Zhou king to appoint the Duke of Qin over his other vassals, and it soon defeated Wei in battle and annexed a great deal of its territory. In the first half of the 3rd century, Qin went on to defeat the states of Chu, Han, and then Zhao, which was the only other major power at that point. Finally, in 251 BCE, Zhuangjiang, the king of Qin, invaded what remained of Zhou territory and received the Mandate of Heaven. Between the years 230 and 221, his son Zheng conquered the states of Han, Wei, Chu, Zhao, Yan, and Qi, and with these victories, a single dynastic state was formed, making Qin the first Chinese dynasty. Though it would turn out to be very short-lived, it served as a model of political and social organization for the more successful Han Dynasty that followed it, and for the rest of Chinese history until the modern era.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.